Welcome everyone to another video in the series talking about peer work. In this video, we are going to be talking about language and peer work, its influence that it can have within our practice and also to other services and how we can role model that. And it also, I guess, introduces the conversation of how different practices can influence each other and how particularly as peer workers, we need to be able to hold pride within our practice and not have other practices from other professions changing the way that we do things and taking on those practices. Before we continue, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands in which we are currently meeting today. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge people with lived experience, ourselves here included, the people we work alongside in the community and our colleagues. And I would also like to pay respects to those that have gone before us and hope that we can continue to honor them in the work that we do every day.
I don't think people give language enough credit for how powerful it is, Chris. We might have heard sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Names actually can hurt a lot. They can really cause long lasting scars. And so I think we really need to give credit to the power of language. And because of that, because of the power of language, we need to be really careful how we're using it, and make sure that we're using language that's strengths-based and uplifting and supporting people,
Yeah.
right? And recognizing, what they've been through, trauma and pain and grief and betrayal, and not just encompass that all into a diagnosis. So I think that the language of diagnosis often diminishes the difficulty that people have been through in their lives. I, I so using my lived experience purposely, it's given a diagnosis of bipolar. Okay. So everybody that I meet can go, well, phase bipolar. But what they should really know about is all the things that happened to me that led to my mental health issue. I don't recognize myself as bipolar.
Mm.
I see myself as a person who had terrible trauma, um, as a small child and then as a teenager, and from car accidents and all sorts of things throughout my life. That's about how I've responded to that. Is within the realm of normal responses to trauma and betrayal and things like that. It's not about bipolar. So the language diminishing everything that's happened to me down to a word, bipolar, that's, it's not reasonable. It's not fair. It's not healthy. And it's damaging, I think, Chris. What do you think about language?
Yeah, I think all the things you said, if I think about, the purpose of language, it's to how we can better communicate and understand each other. And I think when we introduce concepts like needing to name everything and needing to put everything into a group, we can lose so much context and intention with why we were doing that in the first place.
Mm.
Um, which is why I always try to approach language in, what am I actually intending to say? And is that intention coming across? Not just like, this is my intention, therefore you need to understand it in that way. There's always like context and having conversations about context and intention, because that way, even though I may be using a particular way of explaining something or naming something, things mean so many different things to different people. It's about, okay, are we on the same page? Are we understanding each other? Because it really shapes relationships, shape the way that we move forward with everything. Like the example that you used about diagnosis, that then shapes how people are going to interpret and try to understand you and the things that like happen in your life from then on. But they're only applying it through like a keyhole of context. There's not a wider context happening there, so it becomes limiting instead of what it was meant to be, a way to communicate and understand each other.
Yeah,
So it's so
yeah.
important. I always think about like language shapes culture.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it? I mean, we know that happened through like Cromwell stopped the Gaelic language being used in Ireland, and also stopped, dance and music and all that sort of thing. And that really shaped culture by stopping that. That stopped the culture. And
Mm.
that was what he was trying to do. We've seen that with Aboriginal people in Australia when they weren't allowed to use their language, then that impacted their culture. They lost so much of their culture because they lost the language. So we can shut down a culture with stopping language
Yeah.
or using negative language, but we can also build a culture by using positive language, gentle language, kind language, humane language, rather than diagnosis and deficits
Yeah.
focus.
Yeah.
So I also I want to ask you about some examples where you've seen language
Mm.
work beautifully or have an impact, a positive impact.
I worked for a couple of years as a peer worker in a psychiatry liaison service in a primary
Mhm.
care sort of setting. And one of the really amazing things that I saw happen was, going into case conference style scenarios with like the people that access the psychiatrist that we're working alongside. And just through using the language myself and the changes that it brings, the connection, the understanding, the being able to um, have everyone being able to access the conversation. Suddenly, the GPs and the psychiatrist is also very good, working with Flourish Australia and things like that. They took on a lot of that strength-based language and recovery orientated language and all those things, and
Mm.
it really started to shape the way that people were able to build stronger relationships in that primary care setting. And I noticed that just continuously the GPs just started using the language because it was how they were getting better results, how they were being more human. There was no mystery to the things that they were saying. You mentioned a whole bunch of jargon. Not everyone has access to that unless you really work in the industry or you really try to understand what that is. Whereas we already have access to very human language that we can all understand, just showing that in practice about the benefits of that, people just
Right.
started to adopt it.
Right.
And it's
So
great.
even with the GPs, even though they are completely medical model
Yeah.
trained, by utilizing the language that you were modeling, it improved the relationships and then, of course, probably the outcomes
Yeah.
with the doctor. So the
Yeah,
doctor
absolutely.
stopped using so much medical language and started using more strengths-based peer
Mm.
kind of language, and that built the relationships, but
Yeah.
to a better outcome. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even in a further kind of means, I think they were more intentional with their language too. So, like the word complex, when
Mhm.
you think about the word, it's usually used as a synonym for it's difficult or, in a more general kind of way. But really, it's more about that, like it's multifaceted. There's lots of different things to consider. So, the GP may have been using the word in that original context, but the
Mm.
person accessing the service sometimes maybe interpreted like, oh, they're saying that I'm difficult or that my
Mm.
situation's too difficult.
Mm.
Whereas by being curious and like sort of asking about the language they're using, like, hey, when you say complex, what are you intending with that? Is it more so that it's hard, or is it like there's lots of factors? And by asking that and having them question the language that they were using, being able to provide that context actually just means there's so many things to consider. The person actually felt very validated. So it went from, a person feeling like they were being called difficult or like the situation was too difficult and really driving disconnection there, or like, a lack of like hope or hopelessness.
And
It actually
shame probably too.
shame. And yeah, it actually went kind of the opposite. And they felt validated, like, yeah, there are lots of things to consider. I think like I'm glad that's being taken into account just by
Mm.
challenging or maybe like being a bit more intentional with the sort of language they were using and the actual impact and effect that they would have on the other person. So,
It's
hmm,
so beautiful, Chris. I think that just goes to show how powerful it is. If you can shift people who are absolutely grounded in the medical model and the keep everybody at arm's length model, to engage with humane, kind, just person to person language. That's a really powerful thing, Chris. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, I didn't do it with sort of going in there, twirling my sword and sort of being like, hey, you all have to speak this way. It was just by showing it through example, by building good relationships with the other professionals and all those kinds of things. So they knew when I was, compassionately challenging something or suggesting something or providing some insight, it was considered and taken on board. So it also has to come with the way we role model these things too. We can't just sort of go in there completely like and expect to be like, no, you're all wrong. You're all think we need to be able to find a way we can all progress towards
mm,
what's going to be better
mm,
for our own work and also therefore for the people we're supporting. So
mm. Some there's really simple little words that we use that can have powerful detrimental or positive outcomes. And often when I hear people who work for us using ownership language, and they wouldn't even think about it, initially, because they're words that we use, our, my, my child, my mother, my whatever. But for people who we support, I don't think we should be using that ownership language. So I have this guy who's schizophrenic.
yeah,
Just that language there. I have. So I own this person
mm,
and he's schizophrenic. There's a gentleman that I support who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia.
yeah,
That's a very different feel, like I have, to there's a gentleman I support.
changes everything.
Changes everything. And so words like I have, our participants,
Mm,
um,
my person,
my client,
mm,
those kind of things, that we should not be using that kind of ownership language. The other thing that it can give a feeling, subconsciously, I believe, that people have power over that person.
yeah,
My decisions matter over
mm,
this person, but
yeah,
we're a person-led service, so the person should be,
yeah,
owning their recovery and the directions that they take in their life and leading those, not us
yeah,
owning them and therefore over influencing what they can and can't do, what they do and don't try.
yeah,
Um, it's dignified risk and that kind of thing. But I think the other thing about that ownership language, Chris, that is really worrying is that when the staff use that kind of ownership language, it also can make them feel overly responsible.
yeah,
And over time,
mm,
that can burn them out.
mm,
So there's those two reasons that I don't think we should be using ownership language. So because it's not
yeah,
good for either the people that we're supporting or our staff. But the second part of that little quote there, I have this guy who's schizophrenic. So that's back to the language thing. Let's not
yeah,
focus on diagnosis. Let's just
yeah.
focus on what people need and
Mm.
what they want to tell you of their story and their lives overall, not their diagnosis.
Even the small thing, like a small change of phrase, has gone from like someone's identity to someone's experience, to something
Yeah,
that's part of someone's experience rather than something that makes up someone's identity. Of course, we make mistakes and we say different things, but then holding accountability to being like, apologies, da da da, and
yeah,
correcting yourself that makes a huge difference.
absolutely, absolutely. I really want to encourage people not to think about reading the strengths-based language guide that Flourish designed, to actually study it, because it's such a empowering document. It really gives you guidance about how to talk, and that then will really influence the relationship that you have with your colleagues, with our collaborators, but particularly with the people that we're supporting. So, yeah. So, Chris, we might wind it up there with an encouragement of everybody to study the Strengths-Based Language Guide. But was there anything that you'd like to say?
I think language is such like a strong example of something that can be assumed to be, not important because people say, oh, well, I didn't mean to say it that way or something, but there's so much baggage that can come along with language, and things have like a rich history behind them. We're not sure of what that a person's individual history and experiences have been and what that might mean for someone. So yeah, I think just always be intentional, be curious about the language that you're using, and use things like the strength-based language guide, trauma-informed language, human language, because that's going to get us the closest that we can, even before we start to build an understanding with someone, to not bringing along that potential baggage that can come along with some of that other language.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.